Professor Edouard Machery, who's visiting us all of this week. He's a visitor as part of the Philosophy and the Natural Sciences research programme, research grant, which was recently awarded to PPLS. And Edouard has very kindly agreed to talk to us about De-Freuding implicit attitudes.
Thanks, Mark. So thanks for coming tonight, almost tonight, this evening. Thanks, Mark, and to Mikela for organizing my trip here. It's really wonderful to be here. So what I will be talking about today, or this evening, is the nature of attitudes and also of implicit attitudes. And the question I'm really interested in is what kind of things are attitudes and implicit attitudes. When we talk about implicit sexism, implicit racism, implicit attitudes toward a politician, what are we talking about? What's the ontology of these kind of things that we talk about? And if you've been reading a bit of psychology, of social psychology on that topic, and a bit of philosophy over the last 5 years about, you may have made the following picture of the nature of attitude. So according to the dominant tradition, or the traditional picture, what we've learned in social psychology over the last 5, maybe to 10 years, is that people don't have one attitude, but that people have at least two distinct attitudes. One which is often called an explicit attitude, which is the attitude that people are aware of having. An attitude that they can verbalize, they can report, they can express it. Right? But what we've learned, according to many social psychologists and to many philosophers who follow these social psychologies, is that in addition to this explicit attitude, we also have, often anyway, another attitude, an implicit attitude that people have without being aware of having that attitude. And what we've learned also is that our explicit attitude and our implicit attitude can be in tension with one another. We can have, for example, a positive attitude toward other races. So if you're white, you can have a positive attitude toward black people, for example. But in tension with that explicit attitude, you can actually have a negative attitude towards the same group. That's what I will be calling the traditional picture. And if you read any textbook in social psychology about intergroup relations these days, you're quite likely to find that description of how the mind works. If you read many philosophers of psychology, Tamar Gedler, for example, to cite only one, you also will find exactly the same picture. So what we want to be arguing today is that that's just the wrong way of thinking about attitudes in general, and as a result about implicit and explicit attitudes. I will be arguing that it's just a wrong metaphysical picture to have about the nature of attitude. That's going to be the negative part of the talk, but I also want to give you a replacement for this negative claim. I want to explain to you what attitudes really are. And I will be arguing that attitudes are not properly thought of as mental states at all. I will be arguing that attitudes are not mental states. What I will be defending is the view that attitudes are what psychologists have called for now 50 years traits. So the right ontological category for thinking about attitudes is not the category of mental states, it is the category of traits. That's what I will be arguing in this talk. Because they're not mental states, attitudes are neither implicit nor explicit. Because the contrast, implicit versus explicit, is defined over mental states. Right? So I think it's a misnomer to talk of implicit or explicit attitudes. There is no such thing as implicit attitudes, because attitudes are not mental states. They are traits. So it's a misnomer to believe that we have in our mind something like this unconscious attitude that is driving our behavior. You may say, but what about these speech acts, such as I like black people, I'm committed to black and white being treated the same way, men and women being treated the same way. What about these speech acts? What are they doing? Aren't they expressing some kind of attitude? What I will be arguing that they do many things, but one of the things they do is express a mental state, but as I will be explaining to you, the mental state they express just isn't an attitude. Right? It's a complex picture. On my view, attitudes are not mental states, they're traits. As As a consequence, there's no distinction between implicit and explicit attitude. It's a mistaken distinction. And furthermore, that kind of speech acts here does express a mental state, just not an attitude. Now, it may seem like a complex picture. Hopefully, within half an hour, 40 minutes, you'll see exactly how things fall together. Right? So that's the point of the talk, is trying to make sense of that picture, to explain why the traditional picture is actually misguided. So here's the organization of the talk. I will say a few more things about the traditional picture of implicit attitudes. Right? I'll explain a little bit more about how social psychologists and philosophers have been conceiving of explicit and implicit attitude. Then I will describe my own position about attitude, explaining what I mean when I say that attitudes are traits. In section 1 and 2, I won't give you any argument. I will just try to lay out the views which are going to be competing with one another. As you will see, when you spell out the three pictures in detail, it's fairly obvious that's the right thing to say. But that's not very much of an argument. It's just things fall in place when you realize, when you have this picture in view. But then I will give you an argument about why the trait picture is actually a better way of thinking about attitudes than the traditional pictures that identify attitudes to mental states. And then if we've got time, I'll go through 3 objections and I'll respond to 3 objections. But maybe we won't have time to do that. I've got 1 hour mark, right? Yeah, good. All right, so let's start with traditional picture of implicit attitudes. So the first thing I need to do is I need to explain what an attitude is. And I think for those philosophers in the audience, it's quite important to keep in mind that when psychologists and when philosophers in this context talk of attitude, they are not talking about propositional attitude. So in philosophy, a propositional attitude is something like a belief or a desire. It's a relation to a proposition. The belief that Paris is in France is a relation to the proposition that Paris is in France. And different types of propositional attitudes are individuated by their functional role. That's not really what psychologists talk about when they talk of attitudes. Attitudes in social psychology just are liking and disliking. Right? So in social psychology, when you talk about attitude, starting in the 1930s, when the social psychology of attitude was developed, it's mostly about liking and disliking. It's a balanced state. Right? So what characterizes attitude is that there are a two-place relation between the entities that bear the attitude, that has the attitude, and the object of the attitude. And this relation have a positive when it's a liking, or a negative when it's a positive or a negative balance, when it's a liking or a disliking. Right? So the object of an attitude can be extremely diverse. Right? We can have attitudes toward groups, attitudes toward, for example, age groups. We can have a positive or a negative attitude toward older people, a positive or a negative attitude toward younger people. We can have attitudes toward races, obviously, much research in social psychology. Attitudes can be about specific individuals. We can have an attitude, a liking or a disliking of Barack Obama, for example, in the American context, of David Cameron in the UK context, of François Hollande in the French context. Attitudes can be also about abstract ideas. We can have positive or negative attitudes toward values, toward political values, for example. Or they can be also about brands. So a large part of consumer psychology bears on attitudes with respect to brands. So attitudes in social psychology, what we'll be talking about in the next hour, are likings, dislikings. They're two-place relation between the bearer of the attitude and the object of the attitude. These relations have a specific balance from positive to negative. Right? So attitudes are individuated by their true properties, their balance, which can be either positive or negative and more or less strong, and their formal object, what the attitude are about. Attitudes differ from other two-place psychological relations, like attention, for example, by the nature of the formal objects. Right? So we have attitudes towards things that are not the same as what we pay attention to. By their balance, so attitudes have a balance, and by their functional property, what brings attitude about, what brings dislikings about, and what dislikings bring about. So that's just a way of characterizing what attitudes are, in very general terms. An attitude just is a liking, it's a two-place relation between me, who has the attitude, the object of my attitude. The objects can be extremely diverse. The attitude can be positive, negative, weaker, or stronger. And that's going to be shared between my view and the view I'm going to be criticizing. Now, let me say a few things about the view I'm going to be criticizing. As I said earlier, according to most social psychologists these days, there are two types of attitudes: explicit attitude and implicit attitude. It's common to distinguish explicit and implicit attitude by means of two properties: whether or not the attitude, the liking, disliking, is introspectable, whether or not you have first-person knowledge of that mental state, and whether or not this attitude has an automatic aspect on your behavior. Right? So introspectability is just the fact that you know by introspecting yourself that you have that attitude. Automaticity really means that for this attitude to influence your behavior, you need not intentionally retrieve that attitude. Right? Today we'll be assuming that automaticity is a single dimension, which is not uncontroversial. Right? There are many types of automaticity, but I will just be assuming that there's one dimension of automaticity. Now, introspectability and automaticity are obviously, from a conceptual point of view, orthogonal dimension. Right? One could conceive, for example, something which is very low on the automaticity dimension, but very high in the introspectability dimension. Right? So from a conceptual point of view, they're quite independent from one another. But the claim one finds in social psychology is that from the empirical point of view, from an empirical point of view, they are negatively correlated with one another. That's why we have two types of attitude. Explicit attitudes are the ones which are accessible to introspection. You can report them, and they have, and they do not influence your behavior in an automatic manner. Right? By contrast, implicit attitudes, and furthermore, the way they influence your behavior is in an automatic manner. Right? So we've got this picture that attitudes are liking and disliking. So we've learned there are two types of attitude, distinguished by these two dimensions. Explicit are introspectable, and non-automatic, implicit are automatic and non-introspectable. Right? Now, there's a lot of debates in social psychology as well as in philosophy of psychology about the nature of the properties of these kinds of attitudes. For example, there is a debate about whether implicit attitudes are propositional states, whether the way they relate to one another is by means of association, that kind of thing. But there is, by and large, both among philosophers and among most psychologists anyway, some kind of consensus about the ontology of implicit and explicit attitude. There is the idea that explicit and implicit attitudes just are mental states, right? So to have a positive liking of, for example, Barack Obama is to have a specific mental state. To have an implicit liking of Barack Obama is also to have another mental state. What does that really mean? Well, there are three ways of cashing out the idea that implicit and explicit attitudes are mental states. The first way is just by drawing an analogy, just by drawing a comparison. I will take for granted that desires, beliefs, and emotions are mental states, and whatever it means to say that those are mental states, well, explicit attitude and implicit attitude have the same properties, right? So whatever you think makes desire, beliefs, emotion, mental states, the same is going to be true of explicit attitude and implicit attitude. Now, it's not a very informative way of characterizing what it is to be a mental state, but that's the first pass. Here's another way, a better way of characterizing what it means to say that attitudes are mental states. A mental state is a kind of state over which the distinction between type and token is defined. So something is a mental state if it can be tokened. Right? So beliefs are mental states because we can have an occurrent belief, because we can have a token belief right now in my head. Right? This token belief is going to be an event. It's going to be located in time, have a specific temporal location. Right? So to say that mental states, that explicit and implicit attitudes are mental states, is to say that they can occur, just like events. Right? They can happen at a specific time. Because they can happen at a specific times, because they're events, they can enter into causal relations. Right? So events are the kind of things that enter into causal relations. Into token causal relation. One event causes another event. Right? So to say that explicit and implicit attitudes are mental states is to say that there's a kind of things that can occur at a specific moment and cause the occurrence of other mental states and of some specific behavior. Right? So that's a second way of characterizing the claim that explicit and implicit attitudes are mental states. To deny that implicit and explicit attitudes are mental states is going to deny that claim. It's going to say that attitudes are not the kind of thing that can occur, and as a result, they're not the kind of things that can enter into token causal relations. Right? And that's going to be what I will be arguing. There's a third way of trying to cash out this idea that implicit and implicit attitudes are mental states. Let's suppose you are some kind of physicalist philosopher, right? Or maybe a non-reductionist physicalist. So what does that mean? It means that you believe that for every mental state, its token, its instances, are identical to physical mental states, for example, to brain states. Right? So my emotion of fear at a specific moment is identical to a specific brain state. Right? That's a form of physicalism, without going into too many details. Now, if that's a view you endorse, when you say that explicit and implicit attitudes are mental states, what you really say is that whenever that specific attitude or this specific attitude is occurring, I have a specific brain state that is the occurrence of that attitude. So in principle, when you have this specific attitude, I could open your brain, I could cut your skull, open your brain, and point towards a specific, very complex pattern of neuronal activity that would be the occurrence of your implicit or explicit attitude. That's a third way of trying to make sense of the claim that implicit and explicit attitudes are mental states. Alright, so we get the following picture from social psychology and the philosophy of psychology. Attitudes are liking and disliking, characterized by their valence and their object. We have two types of them, the one which are explicit, the one which are implicit. Explicit are introspectable and non-automatic. Implicit are opaque to introspection and automatic. They can be in conflict with one another, but they can of course agree with one another. What's common to both of them is that they are mental states. The kind of things that can be token, the kind of things that can occur at a specific time in your mind / brain, and as a consequence that can cause some further downstream effects. Now, because those ones, the implicit attitudes, are opaque to introspection, we can't just ask people, according to the traditional social psychological picture, can you tell me about your implicit attitudes? So what social psychologists have been doing, and if you know a bit of history of psychology, you know that that tradition has been going on for actually decades. So what they've been trying to do is to find indirect measures, ways of measuring people's attitudes which are opaque to introspection. And what we have in social psychology nowadays are 6, 7, 8, 9 different indirect measures, all of which are trying to assess the strength of these valence states toward groups, ideas, brands, that kind of things. The most well-known one, probably the one you've heard of most, is IAT, the Implicit Association Test, developed by Banerjee, Greenwald, Nosek, and a bunch of other people in the USA. A very famous way of measuring indirectly people's liking and disliking. But it's important to know, that's going to be important the remainder of the talk, that there are actually many other ways of getting at the strengths of these likings and dislikings. Now that picture here should be extremely familiar, because it's really just a new twist on a picture that Freud was embracing about 100 years ago. Now I don't do a history of Freud's ideas, and I've been told that I'm extremely simplifying Freud's ideas, and I think that's probably true. So I want to plead guilty here. But I think there's a common ideas. So in Freud, as you probably know, we have two types of desires, valence states. Some of them we are conscious of, they're, they're introspectable, we can report them. Some of them not so much, and we can't really express them, we can't really report them. They are unconscious. So the distinction between the conscious and the unconscious one is not so much a matter of cognitive architecture, as contemporary social psychologists would do. It's because there is a defense mechanism that prevents the unconscious desire to somehow pop up in consciousness. But despite the obvious differences between Freud's picture of how the mind works, how desire works, there's a clear similarity between the picture that dominates right now in the social psychology of attitude, with these explicit likings that people are aware of, these implicit likings that people are unaware of having, that have an automatic impact on behavior, and this very traditional Freudian picture. And notice the analogy goes one step further. Right? Because we don't have access to the implicit attitude in modern social psychology, we need indirect measures to get at them, to get a grip on their strengths. Right? That's why we have the implicit association test, why we have the go-no-go task, the AMP task, and so on and so forth. Notice Freud was very well aware that because he was assuming that people have unconscious desire, he also had to find indirect measures of these desires, find ways to get at the desires people were unaware of having. And of course, Freudian psychologists have developed tons of indirect measures. The Rorschach test, horrible way to do psychology, but the Rorschach test is just one way of getting indirectly at these sets of mental states that people are said to have. Right? The same is true, of course, of the interpretation of dreams. Why was Freud so concerned with dreams? Because he saw that dreams was one way at measuring, at getting at these unconscious mental states, right? In the same way that modern social psychologists are really into the IAT, the affective priming, and so on and so forth. There are also indirect ways of getting at this group of mental states here. Right. There are obvious differences between Freud's picture and social psychology. No denying that. But I think there's an interesting puzzling similarity. Alright, you may say, but is it really true that philosophers and social psychologists view attitudes as being mental states? And I think here are a bunch of quotations from some of our leading philosophers working on the topic. Tamar Gender says, look, a paradigmatic alif, which is a word she uses for implicit attitude, is a mental state with associatively linked content, and so on and so forth. Uriah Kriegers also said an alif is a mental state whose occurrence, notice, it's a mental state, so it's that kind of thing that can occur at a specific time and stand in causal relationships, what I said earlier, right? Now, what about psychologists? Here is Timothy Wilson, who has been working a lot in a classical insight review in 2000. And Timothy Wilson talks a bit less in terms of mental states, but it's very clear from the terminology he uses that he views mental states as a kind of things that can be retrieved, transported from one bit of the mind to another bit of the mind. Whenever you talk of retrieving attitude, that kind of things, it's a kind of conceptual scheme that is applied to mental states. Right? So I think that kind of way of thinking about attitude suggests that someone like Wilson also conceives of mental states, of attitudes as being mental states. Alright, that's it for the traditional picture. I'm not saying what's wrong with it, I've just been trying to lay out some of the ontological commitments of that view. Now what I want to do next is to spell out my alternative to the traditional picture. So trait picture. So that's the picture I'm going to be attacking in the remainder of the talk. The idea that attitude should be conceived of the model of mental states, such a thing like a belief that Paris in France, a desire to be on vacation, and an emotion. And I'm going to be like, it's just a wrong model for thinking about attitude. So what's the right model? Well, the right model are going to be things like prudence and justice. Right? If you want to think about the ontology of what an attitude is, what it is to have an attitude, think about prudence. Right? Let me explain a bit what that means. What I need to explain to you is what a trait is. So traits are part of both folk psychology and scientific psychology. I will do it in two steps. First, I will give you some examples of traits, and then I will give you something like a characterization of what traits are. Here are some examples of traits. Courage is an example of a trait. Courage is a kind of thing that people have to a greater or weaker extent. People can be more or less courageous. The degree of courage predicts some aspect of their behavior. People who are not very courageous, they tend to run away from tons of things. People who are very courageous, they tend to fight back, right? Furthermore, it manifests itself in a range of different manners. Right? The same is true, of course, of honesty, right? People can be more or less honest, people's degree of honesty predicts some of their behavior, and it manifests itself in a range of manners. Now that's for folk psychology. We find notion of traits also in scientific psychology. Now, personality psychology is by and large based on the notion of trait. So what you have here is a model of the big five. The basic idea is that personality is measured by means of 5 dimensions, and each of these dimensions is a trait. So for example, openness to experience, which must be, I guess, this one. Openness to experience is how open you are to new things, that kind of things. And that's again a trait. You can be measuring it, you can have more or less of openness to experience. It predicts your behavior to some extent, right? And it manifests itself in a really range, in a diverse set of manner. So all the 5 dimensions of the big 5 are actually traits. You have more specific, more specialized trait. For example, Cacioppo and Petty have developed this trait, which is a need for cognition, which is how much you are looking to be in situations where you need to think through matters, problems, puzzles, right? It's 15 items or something like that, maybe 18, whatever. Scale, and it measures specific trait also. So that's example of trait. And what I believe that attitudes should be thought as analogous to that kind of things. Instead of thinking that attitudes are analogous to beliefs, desire, emotions, that's the right way of thinking about what an attitude is. So let me besides giving you some example of what I mean by a trait, let me give you a characterization. Not exactly properly a definition, but at least a characterization of what a trait is. So a trait is a disposition, right, to perceive, attend, cognize, and behave in a particular way in a range of social and non-social situations. Within a species, there are individual differences with respect to a particular trait. Some organisms have more of it, others less. This variation can be measured, approximately measured, obviously, and it is predictive of their behavior and cognition. Now, let me comment on that characterization. So it's a disposition. In philosophy, it's common to distinguish 2 types of disposition: narrow track disposition and broad track disposition. Narrow track dispositions are going to be things like being flammable or being breakable, fragile. There's only one way for a thing that's fragile to manifest itself: breaking. There's only one way for something that's flammable to manifest itself: catch fire. Right? That's a narrow track disposition. It manifests in a single way. Narrow track disposition stands in contrast with broad track disposition. So kind of disposition that manifests themselves in a range of different manners. Right? So the claim here is that traits are broad track disposition. They manifest themselves in a very diverse set of conditions. Furthermore, they are behavioral and cognitive disposition. I do not identify traits with dispositions to behave. Traits are disposition to behave and to think and to feel. Right? They are disposition that manifest themselves in behavior and also in cognition, emotion, experiences. So they have behavioral and psychological dispositions. So that broad track disposition to have some space to have specific mental life and to behave in a range of different situations. Notice that this definition does capture very well all the examples I gave you. Courage, for example, it's a disposition not only to behave, but also to have some specific mental states. So someone who is courageous is less likely to have negative emotional experiences associated with fear, right? Less likely to have negative judgment in reaction to a little spider or a little snake. It manifests also itself in a very diverse set of conditions. It can be measured and it's predictive of behavior. The same is true of openness to experience or the other dimension of the big 5. They are both behavioral and psychological dispositions. They manifest themselves in a range of manner, right? They can be measured and they're predictive of behavior. Right? So that's a way of thinking about what a trait really is. So traits are not mental states, right? So it's important to see that traits are not mental states. Someone may be courageous to a specific degree, right? But his or her courage is not something in her mind. One way to see that is that traits are not the kind of things that happen, that occur at a specific time, right? They're not events, right? So for a trait, for example, a specific degree of courage, you don't distinguish its occurrence from its type, right? So courage does not occur at a specific time. Being open to experience, it's not the kind of thing that can happen, that can occur at a specific time. Right? So a specific degree of extraversion, a specific degree of cognition, they're just not properly thought as being mental states. They don't stand in token causal relationship. Right? So it's not like at a specific moment in someone's mind, there's a specific courage that has happened and that caused that person to behave in a specific manner. Right? So traits are not mental states. However, traits stand in specific relation to mental states. Right? So traits are not mental states, but they depend on mental states. So the relation between traits and mental states is that traits depend on mental states. How courageous you are will depend on a range of mental states that you actually have. It will depend on your moral belief, for example. Whether or not you're courageous will depend in part on whether you believe that fear is shameful. It will depend on your emotional life and how easy it is for you to be afraid. It will, for example, on whether you are a proud person. It will depend also on the strength of your self-control. So your degree of courage, the degree you have of a specific trait, is not a mental state itself, but of course it depends on a motley of different mental states. Right? So I will call that the psychological basis of a trait. Right? So courage is not a mental state, but depends on what kind of mental state one has. Right? Alright, now the claim I want to defend, the trait picture, the one which I think is novel, is the view that attitudes, disliking, instead of conceiving them as being mental states, we should conceive of them as being traits. Right? So an attitude, a liking of Obama, a liking of a brand, Coke, for example, and so on and so forth, a liking of some political idea, liberalism, for example, right, or libertarianism. All these attitudes, they should be thought to as disposition, broad track disposition, to behave and cognize toward an object, the formal object of the attitude, in a way that reflects some preference. Right? So racism, for example, is going to be a broad track attitude manifesting itself in a range of contexts. It's going to manifest in your behavior and in your thinking. Right? It's not a straightforward behavioral disposition, it's a behavioral and psychological disposition toward races, but members of other races, in a way that manifests a preference. Right? So in my view, attitudes are traits. As a result, they're not mental states. Right? Because they're traits, attitudes depend on mental state, even so they are not mental states themselves. So someone's degree of racism is not a mental state, so racism is not a mental state, but it depends in a very complex manner on a motley, on a very heterogeneous group of mental states. People's moral attitude toward racism, the association between concepts, for example, the association between the concept of a black man and the concept of danger, one's emotional reaction in relation to other races, one's degree of self-control. All these heterogeneous set of mental states are going to be what determine one's degree of racism. So racism, sexism, one's attitude toward an object, they're not mental states, they're the disposition to behave and cognize in a way that reflects a preference, but they of course depend on a motley of mental states. Now, supposing this picture is right, what do the indirect measures do? Supposing there's a right way of thinking about attitudes. How to think about indirect measures? What do they do? Well, indirect measures, on my view, they tap into components of the psychological basis of a trait. Right? So when you take, for example, the IAT with respect to race, right? So you go on Harvard's website, you log in, take the IAT, find out, you go through the stuff a few minutes, find out you're somewhat racist, or so you're told anyway by the stuff. What does it do? Well, what it really does is tap into one of the components of the motley of mental states, which together determine the strength of your attitude, right? And different indirect measures are tapping into different components of the psychological basis of that determine a specific attitude. So affective priming, for example, is more likely to tap into one's emotional reaction to mental state, while the IAT is more likely to tap into the association between concepts. Yeah? All right, so that's a trait picture. Now, the last question I want to address before giving you an argument for why the trait picture is a better picture is what remains of the distinction between explicit and implicit attitude in this framework, right? Is there room for implicit and explicit attitude in this framework? And the answer is going to be no, right? So contrast between implicit and explicit makes only sense if you're talking about mental states, right? So some mental states are implicit, other mental states are explicit, right? But that's not a proper definition, that's not a proper contrast to be drawn when one is talking about traits, right? So contrast between implicit and explicit applies only to a mental state. Now you may ask, fine, but what are we really doing when we say or think things like, I like black people? You know, what is this speech act? What we know? If it's not expressing an explicit attitude, what is the nature of that speech act? And what I want to say is that it does many things. Depends on the context. In some contexts, it's just going to be an expressive speech act. Just like black people, good. Black people, positive. Expressing a positive emotion. In other contexts, it's going to be a directive speech act. You're giving yourself an order. When you say, I like black people, what you're really doing is committing yourself to act in an egalitarian manner. Right? So it's a directive speech, it's an order you give to yourself. HF is disguised as if it was an assertion. Right? In other contexts yet, you're going to be expressing a commitment to a norm. So you're going to be a norm expressivist, expressing your commitment to a norm of racial egalitarianism. And yet, in other contexts, it's going to be a proper assertion. It's going to be an assertion about the strength and the nature of your attitude. So in some contexts, what you say when you say I like black people is, here is the nature and the strength of my attitude. You're reporting a judgment about the nature and the strength of your attitude. And how do you do that? Well, the way to do that is that we're going to be introspecting. One way to do it, anyway, it's a psychological matter, but maybe one way to do it is that in some contexts we're going to look at our normative commitments. And if we have anti-racist normative commitments, we're going to be assessing that we don't have any racism. In other contexts, we're going to look at other components of the psychological basis of racism. So for example, here's the kind of things I have in mind. I put you in a lab and I ask you, how racist are you? Odds are that all of you are going to say, not very much, actually not at all, kind of a good guy or a good person. Now I ask you, remember the last time, if you're a white person, that's good, remember the last time it was a bit late, there was this group of fairly agitated young black men, obviously slightly drunk, did you cross the street? And you're going to remember maybe some of your emotions that you may have had at this time. And then I'm asking you, please assess your degree of racism. And your degree of racism is not going to be the same, right? You're going to report, in a sense, oh yeah, well, maybe I'm a little bit racist. I do remember, it's true, at that occasion I did cross the street. And yeah, well, I was a little bit stressed out, but I'm a good guy, really. Assessment of one's degree of X, of one's attitude, is context sensitive and depends on which component of the psychological basis one is focusing on when one is asked the question. Alright, there's no explicit attitude. That kind of speech act, here, does a lot of different things. It can be an expressive speech act, a directive speech act. It can be sometimes just an assessment of one's degree of whatever, racism. And things of courage. When I say, I'm very courageous, what am I doing? Well, I'm doing a few things. I can just say, courage, hoorah! Yeah, I'm expressing a positive feeling. Or I can say, Edouard, be courageous. It's a directive speech act. Or I can say, I can try to assess how courageous I am. In some of the best moments, I'm saying, yeah, am I really courageous? Yeah, not really. And depending on the context, I'm going
going to be focusing maybe on my moral beliefs, right? If you put me in a lab, in a public context, that's what I'm going to be focusing on. In other contexts, I may actually remember how I run away from every conflict I'm ever in. And I'm going to say, no, I'm not that courageous, really, now that you ask me. Anyway, the thing is that there's no explicit attitude in this picture. People have a courage, a degree to behave in a specific manner in front of dangerous situation. There's nothing like an implicit attitude. People have speech acts which do many things. What about implicit attitude? But again, there's no implicit attitude in that speech act, right? In that theory. Implicit attitudes are not part of the picture. What you have is a disposition to behave and think in a specific manner in relation to races, genders, brands, political ideas, and so on and so forth. Right? But there's no place for implicit attitude in that story. It does not mean that there's nothing implicit. Remember, one's attitude depends on a very complex and heterogeneous group of mental states. Some of these mental states may well be implicit themselves, right? So the association between concepts, for example, is not something we have introspective access to, right? It's a very complex part of our cognitive architecture. So we don't know how well our concept of a black man and our concept of danger are associated with one another. So that may well be implicit, right? But implicit attitudes, they aren't part of the picture. And I won't give you an argument yet, but I want to show you why it's exactly the right thing to say, right? So Calvin, when you ask Calvin, he's extremely courageous. He always tell you, look, I'm courageous. Now, Calvin, he likes to run quite a lot. And you put Calvin in any dangerous situation, he's running away. Now, and while he's running away, he says, I'm courageous, I'm courageous, I'm courageous. And he really believes it. He's very sincere about that. Now, here's the wrong way of describing the situation. Well, you have an explicit courage expressed by this speech act, and social psychologists have found that Calvin also has an implicit cowardice. So he's an implicit coward and an explicitly courageous person. Now, that's just the wrong way of describing the situation, isn't it? I mean, that's just a silly way. Now, what I want to tell you is that that's exactly what social psychologists have been doing for the last 10 years. Right? I'm racist. I'm not racist, but I behave in a racist manner. What's the right description? I'm very bad at assessing my own racism. The same is true here of Calvin. It's not that Calvin is explicitly non-racist and explicitly courageous and implicitly a coward. No. He's a coward. And he's very bad at assessing his own cowardice. That's exactly the right way of describing the picture. I think it suggests the trait picture wants to give the same answer for attitudes. Right? It's not like we have an explicit and implicit attitude. Rather, people they tell you all the time, look, I'm not racist, look, no, I'm not sexist. But then you look at their behavior, and they behave like pigs. I should say we behave like pigs. And well, it shows that people are actually sexist. So the right description is that people are sexist, they're racist, they just don't know it. They just are very bad at assessing their own degree of racism, their own degree of sexism. In that picture, there is no place for the distinction between explicit and implicit racism, explicit and implicit sexism. They're just good old-fashioned sexism, a way to behave and to think. Just what we found out is that people are just not so good at assessing how racist they are, which in some way, bad. Duh. I mean, we kind of knew that beforehand, right? So we got more evidence that people are actually more racist than what they think they are. But it's not like we've discovered two types of mental state. Alright. Now, I've not given you any argument. I've just tried to paint an alternative picture. I think that picture, when you think in terms of courage, just makes a lot of sense. What I was saying, things falling in place. Right? That's just a very natural way of thinking about the social psychology which has been going on over the last 10 years. What I want to do in the next 15 minutes, because I'm already running a bit late, is giving you a best explanation argument for my view over the traditional picture. So it's a best explanation argument. What does that mean? It means that the trait picture, the one I've been just describing a few minutes ago, provides a compelling, so I think anyway, unifying, that's what I'm going to try to convince you, account of a disparate array, so a very diverse set of findings, of otherwise quite puzzling findings in the literature on implicit attitudes. So a lot of things which are really puzzling in that literature, particularly if you endorse the traditional picture. If you have the trait picture, at least some of the things start making some sense. Anyway, that's what I will try to argue in the next 15 minutes. Now, I think what should be a horrible embarrassment, and it actually is somewhat of an embarrassment in social psychology of attitude, is that the indirect measures that we have just correlate with one another extremely poorly. Remember I said a bit earlier that social psychologists have developed many indirect measures to try to assess the strengths of people's alleged implicit attitudes. Right? So you can use IAT, you can use a go, no-go task, you can use the AMP. Now, one finding is that all these measures correlate extremely poorly with one another. Now, there's always an upper bound for any two measures, right? Which will depend on their reliability, right? If you know a bit of psychometrics, it should be trivial. But still, you don't expect correlation between two measures to be around 0, right? That's a pretty bad sign. And actually, all these measures, the IAT and many of the priming measures, as you can see, have very low degree of correlation, 0.0, 0.1, which is just extremely low correlation between these measures. Now, that's really puzzling according to traditional picture. Let's suppose we have a specific mental state, the implicit attitude toward, for example, races, and we've got different ways of getting at it. Different measures, you expect an upper bound to the correlation between this measure, but because they're measuring the same thing, it's really quite puzzling if the correlations are between 0 and 1, and 0.1, which basically means between 0 and 1% of variance explained by your measurement. That's nothing, right? And that's a little bit puzzling. Now, on my picture, it makes all the sense. Remember, the psychological basis of a trait is extremely complex. You have a picture here? Yeah. The psychological basis of a given trait is a very heterogeneous set of mental states, and the various indirect measures tap into difference of these mental states. Right? The IAT, mostly, not exclusively, but mostly, one may argue, measures the association between concepts. Affective priming mostly depends on your emotional reaction. And it's not very surprising that there's no correlation between the IAT and affective priming when they're just not measuring the same thing. Right? There's no reason why they should be correlated with one another if they're not measuring the same thing. Right? So on my view, it's not incredibly surprising that the correlations are so low. Quite puzzling if on the traditional picture they're really tapping into the same construct, people's implicit attitude. Another finding is that despite the fact that these indirect measures are poorly correlated in general, you can't move them around. You can easily increase the correlation between some of these measures. So one way which Fazio has been doing is, so Fazio has a specific priming strategy, and you can either ask subject to focus on an individual or on the membership of the categories this individual belongs to. So it shows people a picture. So you show a picture of a black person. You can say, focus on that individual, you're going to have to recognize it. Focus on the race of that individual. Now, if you focus on that individual, you get very poor correlation between Fazio's priming and the IAT. That's what I've just been talking about. If you focus on the category of the individual belongs to, you get, as you can see here, a much larger, somewhere here, a much larger correlation. Again, my picture it's not really clear how the traditional picture is going to be explaining that effect, right? If there's again one mental state, how is it that these two measures correlate in some context but not in another context? Again, my story just makes sense of these findings. In usual situations, IAT and priming tap into different constructs, so there's no reason to expect them to be correlated. However, in some conditions, the same priming will end up tapping into the same construct, which is just one of many components of the psychological basis of racism. So we should expect that some manipulations are going to bump up the correlation between some of these indirect measures. Nothing surprising here, on my view. Now, a third finding, which should be more widely discussed, is that many of these indirect measures have horrendous predictive validity. They just don't predict at all how people are going to be behaving. We're meant to do law and hiring and employment by using these new tools, but then when you look at the predictive validity, you just realize that's really quite scary. So here's a question for you. How do you want to know whether someone is going to be, how someone is going to vote? Here's the answer. Just ask him or her. And that's going to be predictive of his or her behavior. However, if you use one of these indirect measures, particularly the IAT, as you can see, the correlation between behavior and the IAT, the political domain, is about 0.15. Right? Capture about maybe 2%, 3% of the variance. Basically, it captures almost nothing in people's behavior. So indirect measures, and I can see it's a constant feature, have almost no predictive power. Right? Direct measure sometimes don't in the domain of race, right? In the domain of interpopulation, in the domain of gender, sometimes do in the domain of brands, in the domain of political orientation, right? Now, and that's a meta-analysis by Greenwald here, which is a supportive meta-analysis. If you want a more critical meta-analysis, have a look at Oswald meta-analysis in 2013, where the partial correlations between indirect measures and behavior are even lower than this one. Again, it's sort of an embarrassment for the traditional picture, right? So we're supposed to have a specific mental state which has an automatic impact on behavior, and then we see that this mental state, the measure of that mental state, almost failed to predict, or predicts only a very small proportion of people's behavior. Now, it's not like you can't tell a story on behalf of the traditional picture. The measure is noisy, there are many components that influence behavior. So it's not like you can tell a story. But what's remarkable is that it just falls directly. This very low predictive power of indirect measure directly falls out of my view. Again, racism, right, which is a trait that predicts people's behavior, depends on a motley of mental state. The IAT, for example, we saw the graph was about the IAT a minute ago, just tap into one of the components of the psychological basis of the state. Because it's one among many components of the psychological basis of racism, we would not expect that measure to correlate much with racist behavior. Actually, we would expect that measure to be extremely low. So again, that picture falls directly. That finding falls directly. Perfectly makes sense if someone has something like the trait picture in mind. Let's keep that for the sake of time. Another finding which is really interesting, there's been a lot of work on that work, is that people's scores on indirect measures are extremely context sensitive, right? So don't believe when you take the IAT that it represents your racism. It just does not. It's a measure in a specific context. Change the context, you're going to find very different measure, you're going to have very different results for all of these indirect measures. So here's the kind of things. You want to have a good IAT, think of Denzel Washington. You also think of Dahmer, an American serial killer, if you're American. You want to be unbiased about gender, think about the kind of woman you really admire. Nancy Cartwright, if you're a philosopher, a great philosopher of science. Think about her before you take the IAT. Your IAT is going to plunge with respect to women. You're going to do very well. Don't listen to gangster rap before taking the IAT, because if you listen to gangster rap, you're not going to do very well, I promise you. And barbecuing is good, again, not too bad, not so good for your IAT score. It's also not great to eat in the dark, so don't forget to turn the light on before going on Harvard's website. And tons of differences. Anyway, the IAT can be pushed around in fairly dramatic manner. Tons of variables. Now, it's not like, so that's a traditional picture. The traditional picture, of course, is compatible with a fair amount of contextual variation. They can say, look, it's not very surprising there's a specific mental state here that context will influence the occurrence of that mental state. So, the traditional picture does make sense of some contextual variation. What it's really bad at predicting is, or what it has very few resources for doing, is telling us which form of contextual variation to be expecting. Why? Because it just posits a new mental state about which we don't have any theory. So traditional picture the trait picture, the one I'm trying to sell you, just has a lot of resources in that respect. Because what you have here are just good old-fashioned mental state, association between concept, emotional reaction, self-control. We know a whole lot about the contextual determinants, about the moderators of these mental states. We know very much about what influences people's emotion. Fear, for example, is massively influenced by darkness. Right? People have a much lower threshold for fear reaction when they're in the dark. Self-control influenced by how tired you are, by how little time you have to do something. So all these mental states, we know a lot about the contextual determinant. So here we have a lot of resources to explain the kind of contextual variation that social psychologists have been discovering over the last 10 years. So it's not just simply the fact of contextual variation, which of course makes sense on both accounts. It is the fact that the trait picture, by just positing good old-fashioned mental state, has a lot of resources to explain the kind of contextual variation that has been found in social psychology. Right? So the outcome here is that, look, there's tons of different findings. It's not like the mental state picture could not explain each of them. It could. That's not the claim. Right? But it's going to have for each of them to find a different ad hoc explanation, a different set of explanation. The advantage of the trait picture is that you give a unifying explanation of all these findings. They all fall out from the trait picture. You don't need to appeal to ad hoc assumptions to make sense of the findings in social psychology. Right? So the superiority is not that the old picture cannot explain them, it can, but it explains them less well because it needs to provide different explanation for different findings. So I'm almost running out of time, so I won't go through the whole list of objections. I just mentioned the first one, perhaps one you've had in mind already. So the notion of trait, as I said earlier, has been in social psychology for maybe 40, 50 years, maybe 60 years by now. So it's a really old notion in social psychology. Lots has been written on it. And it has been actually debated in social psychology and in the philosophy of psychology whether the notion of trait is a good notion to explain behavior. So back in the 1970s, 1980s, as probably most of you know, there was a debate between so-called situationists and other psychologists. And according to the situationists, the way to explain people's behavior is to look at features, properties of the circumstances. Right? If you want to explain why people behave the way they do, don't look inside people, don't look about their dispositions. Right? That's just a wrong way to explain people's behavior. What you should be looking at is aspects of the circumstances. Right? So for example, a very famous experiment, you leave a dime in a phone booth, just before, well, two conditions. One is a dime in a phone booth. 1980s, the dime was more than what it is today. And there's a condition, no dime in a phone booth. People come and pick up the phone to give a call. There's someone who come and let her books or papers fall on the ground, big mess. If you found a dime, you are 10 times more likely or 8 times more likely to help that person pick up the paper than if you have found nothing. Right? So just a trivial feature of the environment, finding a dime, has a dramatic impact on people's behavior. Right? That's the situationist literature. Now, some philosophers, generists, have said, well, look, the right implication of that literature for philosophy is that the notion of a trait and similar notions just they're not very useful when one theorizes about human behavior. And of course, I've been using the notion of trait to make sense of the literary attitude. So I better say that Doris is actually wrong. And I said that Doris is actually wrong. I think it's a lot of good things in Doris and Hamann, following Lisbeth and other people's work. A lot of good things in that research tradition. But I think it's just not the case that traits are useless to predict behavior. In fact, when you aggregate across situation, right? So when you don't look at a specific instance of behavior, but when you aggregate across behavior, traits are extremely predictive. Right? You can see that people who score more highly on an altruistic measure tend across situations to behave in a more altruistic manner. Even so, for any situation, it's hard to predict whether or not they're going to be behaving in an altruistic or not manner. So when you aggregate across situation, you can see that the notion like traits is actually predictive of behavior. And also it's worth pointing that the problem here is not simply limited to the notion of trait. If it's true that the right way to explain behavior is by focusing on situations, it's bad news for the trait picture. It's also fairly bad news for the traditional picture. Right? It just means focusing on people's mental states. It's just not a particularly useful way to predict people's behavior. Right? We better focus on the circumstances in which they are located. So that problem would not only cut against my views, it would also cut against my opponent's view. And I stop that for the criticism, but let me just summarize. I think the conclusion is that if you look at the psychology of attitude and the philosophy based on this psychology, attitudes just end in the head. They're not the kind of thing that is located in people's mind. They're not mental states, as fortiori they're not brain states. Rather, they're just behavioral and cognitive dispositions. They are disposition to behave in a specific manner, to have a specific cognitive life that reflects some preferences towards some object, a kind, a group of people, an individual, an abstract idea. So racism just isn't located in your head. It's not that racism does not depend on what's in your head. Of course, racism depends on your mental states, right? But it depends on a very complex group of mental states. And it's not the right picture to be thinking about things like racism. It's just a mistake to introduce a distinction between implicit and explicit racism in exactly the same way as it would be a mistake to introduce a distinction between explicit courage and implicit courage. That would be the same type of mistakes. If you're interested, there's a paper coming out on these ideas in maybe one day published book by Jennifer Saul and Michael Bronstein, Implicit Attitudes. And thank you for your attention.